Welcome to Wild Tater, the Food Forest podcast. I'm Charles Hathaway. This is the introductory program for the podcast. We're just going to briefly talk about what a food forest is, or forest gardening. Those terms mean the same thing. Now, in order to illustrate this, in order to help you visualize it, I want you to take a moment and picture something for me. Okay, a scenario. And I want you to really concentrate and really picture this in your mind. If you can close your eyes, do it. If not, just really try to concentrate on this picture, okay? I want you to imagine that you have been invited to a friend's house for dinner. And you go and you have a wonderful time with this friend. You have incredibly fresh, delicious food with them. You're feeling great. You finish up and your friend says, let's go out in the backyard. So you step out into the backyard, and there's a small patio, okay, and beyond that, it looks like it's pretty much the edge of the yard, that this patio is as far as it goes, and it kind of makes you think for a moment that, you know, how sad it is that properties have become so small that your friend has to pretty much have a patio for a backyard, and that's it. But regardless, it's a nice little patio, and so you're out there with your friend, you're like, oh, this is a nice place, beautiful. And you're especially interested to see beyond his backyard how close he is living to the wilderness. Now, prior to pulling up to your friend's house, you had noticed that he was living in a small but suburban neighborhood. So this wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but now you're kind of impressed to see that he's right on the edge of the wilderness. And there's a nice little trail going out from his property out into this wilderness, and your friend says, let's go take a walk. And you start down this path into this forest, and immediately you recognize this atmosphere because you've been in this kind of an atmosphere before. You have taken hikes or gone fishing, and it's this kind of what you might describe as a moderate climate rainforest. There's this canopy of trees overhead, and there's these vines and ferns underneath that stretch up over the path, leaving just enough room for you to walk in the middle between these two beautiful, just lush green walls on each side, and all from the sky down to the ground there is just beautiful green, dew dripping off the ends of the leaves, and you're just deeply impressed with this gorgeous forest before you. And as you walk just a few steps into this, your friend stops you and says, here, try some. And he pulls off the tip of one of these ferns that's out in the wilderness and offers it to you, and you're kind of like, I don't know that I want to eat that. I don't know what it is. And he's like, oh, that's fine. He pops it in his own mouth and starts eating it. But then he reaches out and says, how about some of this? Reaches into the greenery to where you can barely even see, and pulls out a handful of the luscious grapes that you've ever seen. Just this beautiful handful of plump, ripe, juicy grapes. And your first thought is, well, can I eat these? Are these wild or what? But your friend starts popping them in his own mouth as well, and so you try them, and they're delicious. And then he reaches down further and pulls a couple of raspberries off of the ground and hands them to you. And you're like, oh, thank you. Wow, this is quite the lush area here. And then he takes a couple of steps further and points to a tree that the grapevine is climbing, and says, it's too bad you didn't get here earlier in the year, because we got almost a gallon of maple syrup out of this thing. And you look up and you can see that it's this gorgeous maple tree, but it is one of these red, deep purple color maple trees, and you weren't aware that maple trees that weren't sugar maples could produce maple syrup, but your friend insists that it was a lovely batch of maple syrup. And okay. But then he reaches down and starts pulling on the grass below and offers you some. And you take it in your hand and you're looking at it and you're like, oh, that's some nice wild grass. Why are you? You're kind of thinking, why are you handing me grass? And then he takes some himself and pops it in his mouth. And you're like, you're eating the grass? And he's like, oh, no, that's chives. And then you see him pull another grass out from the ground and pop it in his mouth. And you're like, but I don't think that one's chives, is it? And he says, no, that's garlic. And as your friend takes a few steps further, you notice this beautiful, warm aroma in the air that smells like maybe a little bit of licorice, maybe something of roses. It's just this gorgeous, natural smell that makes you think of the phrase, stop and smell the roses. This is what they're talking about. I mean, this is just this lovely aroma in the air. You take a few further steps in with your friend, and all of a sudden, right in the middle of the path is a fence. It just cuts off the path. And you step up to the edge of this fence, and you realize that beyond this fence is a lawn. It's like the forest suddenly cuts off, and somebody built their house right in the middle of this lawn, and you look, and it's another yard. And you turn to your friend, and you're like, dude, what's with the fence in the yard? And he says, oh, well, that's the edge of my yard. And you're like, wait a minute, I thought your yard ended back at the patio back there. And he says, no, it comes out to here. And you ask him, well, where did this forest come from? How did you manage to buy a chunk of forest? And he says, oh, I didn't buy it. I grew it myself. And you look around and you can see this lush, incredible forest around you that just has these wonderful smells, these foods that your friend keeps eating. And then you look at that fence that separates his yard from the neighbor's yard. And beyond this fence is just this well-manicured lawn and a nice little patio, similar to your friend's, but without any kind of forest as you're standing in. And as you realize that this is really your friend's yard, he's got probably maybe a quarter acre of land that his house and this little forest are in, and in it you can see him over there pulling a leaf off a tree and eating it. And you ask him, well, how long did it take you to grow this? And he said, oh, I'm going on about 12 years now. Most of it took 10 years, and the last 2 years I've just been mostly gently maintaining it. And you're like, wait a minute, you're maintaining a forest? And he's like, well, it's a forest garden. Everything here is either food or medicine or can be used in some other way. And as you stand there looking around at this incredible garden of forest, where there are foods and there are flowers and there are just everything that you can imagine, birds chirping, everything that you picture being in a forest, including some kind of trickling spring sound coming from somewhere deep within, which you can only imagine must be a fountain or pond of some kind. As you're thinking about this, you're reminded of the scene from the new Willy Wonka movie, where Willy Wonka brings them into this garden that is all made of candy. Everything is candy, and the kids can eat these gummy grasses and the chocolate waterfall and all of these things, and you realize that that's the closest analogy you can come up with to what you're seeing right now at your friend's place. Because here he has created this forest of food. Now let's come back to the present. I don't want you to go and visit your friend at their food forest. I want you to be the friend who has the food forest. And I know the response that many of you will have is, Well, I don't have room to grow a forest. I only have a small patch of land. But let me take away that misconception right now. A forest garden can be any size. My first forest gardens were in a small half-gallon, maybe close to a gallon size pot. Unless you assume from that I just had a plant in a pot, I had a tree in a pot with plants surrounding it. It looked like a small bonsai of sorts. It was a tiny mulberry tree that I was cutting back like a bonsai and growing with some other plants in it, and it looked like a little forest. Now, the only reason that I did it in such a small pot was because I was living in an apartment building and was not allowed to grow anything anywhere. So since I had this pot, I just put it on my porch, watered it every day, kept it alive for a couple of years until I moved into my first home, which was 1/10 of an acre. I planted this little mulberry tree in the front lawn, turned my front lawn into a forest, and within a couple years, it was producing these beautiful little mulberries. The tree, I don't know if it was stunted because of the pruning I'd given it for a couple of years, or if it was just a dwarf variety of mulberry, but I planted it in the ground and it grew to about 4.5 feet tall. This beautiful little lollipop tree looked like a miniature version of a large tree, grew these beautiful mulberries every year that we could get a couple of bowls of mulberry yogurt out of every year. It was an exciting thing for my kids. It was exciting for me. But the point is that you can have a forest garden of any size. You can have it in a pot. You can have it in a small plot, like a 10-foot by 10-foot garden, as most people have, or you can have it encompass your entire yard. That's my goal with the 5 acres that I now own. I want a 5-acre food forest, and I have to use forest gardening methods to create it. Which brings on the big question. If this is what a forest garden is, how does one create it? And here's your basic answer. You create a forest by understanding the functions of a forest, how it works, and then you implement those principles into your garden. Essentially, you are trying to mimic nature. All right? Now, if you're interested in this as a topic on a broad scale and would like to redo your whole system, I encourage you to study permaculture design. That's kind of the basis of where this all comes from. And permaculture design spans many different fields, such as energy use, the function of people in an ecosystem and in society, and so forth. And it can include everything from transportation to the type of house that you have, and it encompasses many things. Forest gardening or food forestry, I would call the branch of permaculture that is specific to plants and plant systems. Now, some people are going to hear this and they're going to say, that sounds like a heck of a lot of work. And the fact of the matter is, it is a lot of work up front. But once you get it established, just like a real forest out in the wilderness, it will not need much of any maintenance. And depending on how you set it up and what kind of plants you use, how you structure your yard and so forth, it may not any longer need any maintenance whatsoever. So you'll have a couple of years or so of you working your head off while your neighbor is just stepping out and 10 minutes of mowing his lawn, and then 10 minutes of clipping his vines, and then another 10 minutes of edging his sidewalks. And he's looking at you working your head off for a year, maybe 2 years, and just going, man, that I couldn't do that. That's too much work for me. And then after 2 years, things start to switch, and you're spending, 10, 20, 30 minutes a week out in your yard just the same as he is, and he's seeing these beautiful results that you're getting, but he's like, well, he's still got to work and so forth. And then after 7, 8 years of a little bit of work, he never even sees you doing work. You're sitting out eating in your yard, eating the apples from your trees, your peaches, your grapes, and you're going out and making these lovely herbal teas out of your mint and lemon balm and chamomile and just having this lovely time going out and harvesting. And your neighbor eventually comes to find out that you're doing less work, and the work that you're mostly doing is harvesting, collecting the fruit, collecting the garlic and onions and potatoes and the plants that you're growing. You're just going out and getting food out of your yard and taking it inside. And he is spending 10 minutes every week mowing his lawn, 10 minutes hedging his sidewalk, 10 minutes pruning his vines. And he's going to see that you have so much more abundance than he has. Now, I'm not talking about this in order to try to, appeal to your prideful, envious nature that wants your neighbor to be jealous of you. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm just trying to give you a visual idea of the kind of work that's put into this. Yes, there's a bit of work put up front in order to get the shape of the land that you want, in order to apply the mulches and so forth, in order to jumpstart your system. But once that system is in place, the biggest work that you'll be doing is picking the fruits and harvesting the food. It will all just be right there, growing on its own without any input from you, other than maybe occasionally sprinkling water or running water in the really, really dry season. The rest of the season, it all takes care of itself. That's what a true forest garden looks like. And that's, to me, much more self-sustaining, much less work than having to put in a half hour a week for the rest of your life, and much more self-reliant as well, because you'll be able to bottle as much fruit as you want, and you'll be able to bring friends over to bottle as much fruit as they want, and you'll be able to harvest fresh greens and herbs, make your own spaghetti out of almost everything of your own. You buy the noodles and everything else is out in your garden. The tomatoes, the oregano, the basil, the bay leaf, the thyme, everything that goes into your spaghetti sauce is out in your garden. It's there for the taking at any time. Now, of course, there are seasons, and so some things are going to be ripe at some times and other things at other times. But in a true forest gardening system, when the thyme is done with its season, there's something else that's starting its season. And so there's this cycle of life constantly happening. If you're an observer of the nature around you, if you watch, even in your own yard, your own lawns, if you will, you'll notice there is a seasonality to different things. The clover does not come and go at the same time that the dandelions and the daffodils grow. And yet, if you've got these in the same space, they will occupy the same space at different seasons. When you design for that, you never have a dry moment in your yard. Sure, your daffodils get done with their season, but then you've got the strong rhubarb or whatever growing in their place. That is what a forest garden is. It's a fully functional forest in whatever space you've got. But it's full of plants that are going to be of benefit to you, things you can harvest. For example, someone could grow a fir tree, kind of a Christmas tree type of a thing, or and have, this nice little Christmas tree, the nice pine smell, everything that they like about having a little Christmas tree in their yard. Or they could replace that with a pine nut tree, one of the pines that are grown for nuts. And they have all those same benefits, but they also have nuts. And they gather these nuts, sell them at farmers market for $5 a pound, and are able to make a profit off them. That's another aspect that I want to point out with a forest garden that is beneficial, that goes beyond what an ordinary garden can do. An ordinary garden, you plant your rows and you get your vegetables out of them. You take them to the farmer's market and you sell them if you want to. You eat some yourself and you sell some. You make a little bit of a profit, and then you've got to start over next year. You buy the seeds, you buy the fertilizer, you buy the soil, and you start all over again. And in the end, it comes out that you're pretty much paying about what you got at the farmer's market into next year's garden, if you do all the calculations. Some people are losing money considerably on it, but they're doing it out of the love of doing it, which is great. That's great. But if you do this in a perennial forest system, they will come without any additional money put in. Maybe some money to buy it up front, maybe some money for mulch or something to get the soil ready and get it started. But it's once, maybe twice, that you're buying any additives to get these systems going. And after that, year after year after year, they come on their own. And here's a great thing about it. In a properly functioning forest garden system, there's no such thing as weeds. Not just because you let them grow, but because there is no need for the weeds to be there. Now, wait a minute. No need for the weeds to be there. You can try to explain all you want to a weed why it doesn't need to be there. It will not listen, right? Wrong. Let me explain briefly why that's the case. In any element of a forest system, in any element of nature that comes of its own accord, or because nature put it there, either because an animal carried it there, or it grew from root rhizomes growing underground, whatever. How it got there was not put there by man, and it grew there on its own. In an ecosystem, there are many functions that need to be met, and nature finds a way to meet those requirements, either through the passage of time or right away. But those functions will be met. So let's take the example of a bindweed. What is the function, the ecological function of a bindweed? Well, there are several, but one of the biggest is that bindweed covers the ground in order to protect the soil, in order to prevent the sun from sterilizing the soil. You keep soil bare long enough, and sun will fry it. It will kill the microbiotics on top. It will kill the fungal just below, and it will just make it sterile dirt, which sounds great to the gardener who hates weeds. But think about this for a moment. If a bindweed steps in, and as it will in any compacted, beat-up soil, it will grow up and through, and it will cover the ground. What does that covering of the ground do? Well, it makes it so that when it rains or when there is dew, the water, the dew rests on the ground, and it is shaded, so the moisture lasts longer, which of course helps the bindweed because it's happy to keep its water available. So it grows more bindweed and thickens until you've got this thick patch of bindweed across this entire, roadside or whatever that has been degraded. And it begins to, underneath it, rebuild soil life. The positive bacterias begin to return. Fungal hyphae begins to return in small numbers. It's still a rather degraded ground, but it's working to repair it. Once there is a little bit of repair, other things start showing up. Dandelions, alfalfa, different things that are often considered weeds, but they have an ecological function. A dandelion will dig its roots so deep and be able to pull nutrients from deep underground up toward the surface. And then as those leaves die off in the fall, and the flowers and everything die off, it leaves those nutrients in the soil for everything else to use, as well as its roots being interlocked and linked with other plants so that they can get the nutrients from the dandelion as well. A dandelion is considered a dynamic accumulator. It accumulates nutrients dynamically and makes them available to everything. And then, of course, the alfalfa comes in because it's so hardy and it blew in from, a nearby alfalfa cover crop or whatever. And it serves to nitrogen fixate, which means that it takes nitrogen out of the air, which if you do your science homework, you find out that nitrogen is in the air all the time. The stuff we're breathing is not 100% oxygen. It's actually a great deal of nitrogen. Alfalfa will take that nitrogen out of the air and it will put it into its roots, and it will put it into its leaves, and it will put it into these little nodules that are like little nitrogen packs on its root system. And then other plants reach in and they are able to draw from these little nitrogen packets in the soil. And as any major gardener knows, nitrogen is one of those things that your garden wants. So having this nitrogen fixer there, which is the wild alfalfa, the dynamic accumulator, which is the dandelion, and having this soil reclamation system, which is the bindweed, all these plants are able to create this healthy ecosystem. Now, if you don't want dandelions and bindweed and alfalfa, as many people don't, what you need to do is figure out what function that plant is filling in your system, in your garden, and you need to replace it with something else that fills that function. So, for example, the nitrogen fixer, this alfalfa that you keep getting, which is a perennial and will therefore keep coming back on its own, even from small bits of root, you could replace that with an everlasting sweet pea. Now, an everlasting sweet pea is not the same kind of peas that you get like garden peas. It will grow pods that look like little pea pods, but you don't want to eat those pea pods. But let me tell you what you do want to eat. The flowers. The flowers of the everlasting sweet pea taste exactly like peas, have similar nutrients, have a crispy, just absolutely delightful texture. It's not like eating a rose petal. If you've ever eaten a rose petal, it's not a terribly unpleasant experience, but it tastes like a rose, smells, which is not something that you think to eat. You think no, it smells delightful, but it doesn't smell like something I want to eat. That is not the case with the sweet pea. The sweet pea, you eat it, it tastes like you're eating a garden pea, and it's delicious. So if you were to replace, take out that alfalfa and plant an everlasting sweet pea there, you now have a food source that is providing that nitrogen fixing function. And what you'll also find is that it grows kind of like a bindweed. It climbs things, it covers the ground and reaches up fence lines and so forth. And you'll find that it behaves like a bindweed, but not being as destructive, quote unquote destructive, as a bindweed. It fulfills the function of both the alfalfa and the bindweed. So it's protecting the soil. It's even digging deep and getting some nutrients from deep down underneath. It may even reduce your dandelion population. But there's other plants that you can put there to fulfill the dandelion function. The point of all of this is to recognize and know the function of every element in an ecosystem so that you can create a version of it that you want. Now, unless you have been exposed for a period of time to the concept of permaculture design, most of you have grown up with one of basically two different views on how to grow food. The first is you have your little garden bed and you plant a row of carrots and you plant a row of tomatoes or something to that effect. And there will be variations of people, doing things like, square foot gardens or they'll have, raised bed gardens and all these things, but they'll generally follow this pattern of planting the annual foods that they want, and then they will harvest them at the end of the year. And maybe they'll put some mulch or some compost into their garden, which is all good. It's all very healthy and great. But that is one of the approaches that people are familiar with, taking this gardening approach. The other is the agricultural approach, where there is, several acres, maybe thousands of acres even, of just rows and rows and rows of corn, or rows and rows and rows of potatoes, just, a square mile of potatoes, or a square mile of a certain crop. And then they have threshers come in and take it and harvest it and so forth. And maybe if they're being responsible and trying to be sustainable, they will have some cover crops that keep the ground healthy and so forth. So there's not a lot of time with bare ground. But even in the best of circumstances, what you're seeing is you put in the seeds, you grow the crop, you remove everything, and then you plant again. Okay, that is the two basic views that some variation of those is taught in modern society. Your garden bed and your agricultural field. What I'm trying to propose is that there is an alternative to both of those. And it is the alternative that says that nature has been gardening for thousands upon thousands, perhaps millions of years. And it has been doing it in a way that it is self-sustaining, self-perpetuating. In my mind, that is far more sustainable than even an organic garden, because an organic garden uses, earth-friendly, eco-responsible chemical replacements. You kind of do this traditional garden style, but using responsible, sustainable labeling, organic stuff, okay? And I have no problem with that. I'm not trying to diss on the organic gardening methods. What I'm trying to help you see is that is not necessary. You can have a fully organic, heirloom, open pollinated system that is completely nature sustained with the minimal work on your effort other than upfront setting up this system, putting in the right plants in the right places and setting up this system so that it completely takes care of itself. Now, if you were to ignore your land, if you could somehow protect it, fence it off and say humans are not to touch this for 1,000 years, what would you have after 1,000 years? You would have a forest. Depending on how close you are to a forest system now, it may be a thick forest, it may be a sparse forest, but it would be a forest. It would take probably about 1,000 years for it to become a fully mature system, self-sustaining. It would extend beyond the fence by then, of course, but as long as it's protected from human interaction, it would become a forest. What we're doing in this effort to create a forest garden of our own is we're bypassing the hundreds of years of natural succession and manually inputting it ourselves. So while it may take 100 years for a raspberry to show up, because, at some point some bird is going to eat a raspberry and then is going to drop its droppings in your patch of land, eventually there's a good chance a raspberry could end up there. And same with just about any other plant, or blown in the wind or whatever. And because of what nature does, it would eventually become a thriving forest. Now, it may not be a food forest because it will grow poisonous foods. It will grow lovely canopy trees that, aren't very useful to people except for maybe shade and things like that, maybe wood. But if you manually design these things, if you understand how a forest works, what's in a forest, what the elements of a forest are comprised of, and you manually place them there, then nature will eventually pick up on that and realize, oh, okay, I can do this because I'm totally familiar with what this is, and it will take care of it, and it will raise it and perpetuate it. And all you'll have to do is some minor maintenance to kind of guide that succession that nature is already prone to do. It's really that simple. And the result is, instead of having some poisonous but beautiful plants and other, canopy trees that provide shade and wood, but otherwise not really anything, what you've got is lush gardens of medicinal plants, and you've got nut trees and fruit trees which are providing canopy and shade and bird habitat and animal habitat, and you've got grasses that are edible to local browsers, and that maybe a few birds or animals that you keep on your property, they're feeding those animals in such a way that you really don't have to provide feed for them except maybe in the coldest part of winter. And you're able to have this system available for feeding you, for feeding your family, for feeding any animals that you have, for perpetuating this successive forest. Now, I hope that has given you a little bit of a vision of what's possible. Now let's start just briefly talking about what a forest is, so that we can begin to understand the principles of a forest and then implement them into a forest garden to create a forest of food and medicine and beauty and whatever else it is that we want to create. Okay? A forest, by definition, is a particular type of ecosystem where there's perennial trees, perennial shrubs, perennial herbs, and they're all grown together, mushed together, and they support one another through an exchange of energies. Okay, and these energies may include things such as protection from elements. They may have nutrient sharing. They may provide each other shade and sunny niches, okay? They'll provide wildlife habitat and annual mulching, because their leaves will fall and mulch. The sticks will fall out of the trees, the cones will fall out of the trees and mulch the ground all the time. It's this self-perpetuating system called an ecosystem. It's a particular kind of ecosystem. All right? And a forest it's not just a group of plants haphazardly thrown together. If you were to just haphazardly throw a bunch of plants together, what nature will do is weed out the ones that don't work in the ecosystem and then replace it with other ones that do, so that what you would have in the end, which is to say 10 years later, is something that's very different than what you started with, but it's nevertheless an ecosystem. It would have some of the same plants that you started with, and then many others that you did not start with. Okay? So you can throw plants together to create an ecosystem, but it's not going to create it exactly as you are picturing unless you understand the principles of that ecosystem. Okay? You might even say that a forest is a fractal of life, okay, where every level of life, be it microscopic or the visual level that you can see, or maybe even over miles, the forest for the trees view of things. Okay, life takes place in a well-structured cycle. Think about it. If you go out into a forest and you just take a little square centimeter of ground and you were to look under a microscope, you would see an entire forest taking place in that square centimeter of ground. It would be composed of fungus and bacteria and tiny little nematodes in the soil. And it would look like a miniature, albeit alien, landscape. You zoom out to the broad scale and you look at, say, a continent at a distance. And what you will see is it looks like kind of like this moss changing of colors and shapes over the seasons, but it's a life structure that is taking place in this big way. And then you can zoom back to your own level where you see the trees, you see the bushes, you see fruits growing, falling, blossoms. Life takes place as a fractal. Okay, and the further you zoom out, the more you can see it's still taking place. The further you zoom in, the more you can see it's still taking place. The element that separates a forest from other types of ecosystems is the prominence of cover story and understory trees, which is to say you've got trees that are like a giant umbrella covering the landscape. Imagine these 150-foot trees versus the small apple trees that are, maybe 15 feet tall, something like that. Those would be an understory tree. You've got cover story trees and understory trees. The massive, giant pine trees and the smaller, maybe 20-foot trees below. Okay, in a forest, there's a dominance of trees. There will still be many other things in the system, including grasses and vines and bushes and so forth. But in a forest system, there's a dominance of trees. Okay, in a tropical type setting, the equivalent is a rainforest or a jungle. Okay, in a temperate system, as most of the United States is, as much of Europe and Asia, it's almost all temperate systems, and so you get forests. That's the result that you have from that kind of a setup. Now, in a mature natural forest, you're going to find such a thick layer of trees that imagine a squirrel wanting to get from one point to another, maybe even one mountainside to another. In a truly mature forest, they could make it across the tops and branches of trees without ever having to touch the ground and get from one point to another across a landscape. And that is kind of your ideal mature system, where it's that thick. But you'll also notice that between these groves, thick patches of trees, there are meadows, and where there are wildflowers and wild grains and herbs of all kinds. They abound. You'll also notice different kinds of trees between the meadow and this mature, thick forest. And they will be some of your understory trees and some immature cover story trees. And so you'll have these various layers, and we're going to talk in future sessions about the edge effect, which is a really cool principle in growing things and maintaining the edge effect to keep things from going too mature. We'll talk about that so that you can get the greatest amount of fruit and harvest out of the things that you're growing. Now, what I've just described is a forest. Now, a forest garden, on the other hand, is a system that's described that way, but the plants in the ecosystem can be used as food and medicine for people and their animals. And for the most part, these systems can be established by gentle substitution. We talked a little bit about that. Okay, where, for example, where a blue spruce might abound if it was a forest, you could put pinyon pines, which can provide edible pine nuts. They can provide edible needles, edible inner bark, and they can also provide resin for flavoring. And like the spruce, the pine can be used for firewood or building material or even a Christmas tree. And while it's not fair to see a plant as being only valuable for its uses, which there are many once you study it, knowing these uses turns something of a beautiful inherent worth into something that also sustains life and increases prosperity and abundance. Okay? In this class, in the following sessions, we're going to be focusing on forests of a deciduous temperate climate. Okay, so the U.S., Europe, and so forth. If you're in a tropical climate, you will have slightly different rules for you maintaining a jungle system. Most of us in the moderate climates are very jealous of you, but we don't have need to be. We can create incredible things in our temperate climates that are not available in tropical climates. Okay, so as I've mentioned already, a forest garden can be started by simply planting a bunch of stuff close together. But if you take the time, if you just take the time to study these things and understand how a forest works, the kinds of things we're going to be talking about in this class, you'll not only save yourself a great deal of time and effort, but you'll also have a much greater abundance of beauty and food in your system. Now, I've heard of people on a quarter acre of land producing 6,000 pounds of food. I have not experienced that myself because I haven't been at it long enough to get that mature of a system, but those are the kinds of things that are possible. It just takes a little bit different thinking. Instead of having an acre of corn, you've got an acre of corn and of licorice and of maple and of hazelnut and of thyme and Greek oregano and whatever. All these different things, you take all that, add it all up, you got 6,000 pounds of food or 600 pounds of food. Probably get 6,000 depending on how you do it or the size of your land, whatever. But the point is that if you get 600 pounds of apples, that's great. You're not likely to eat 600 pounds of apples even in, a year. But you are likely to eat 600 pounds if there is, 10 pounds of apples, a pound of raspberries, a half pound of oregano, whatever. And you're more likely to eat more of your food if you're producing it in this biodiverse way. Which brings up another important point that we'll make to a forest garden. Things grow much more abundantly when there is diversity. That doesn't mean that you can't grow a row of something, a row of carrots, a row of radishes, a row of whatever. But if you've got them mingling with each other in the right kind of format, you can get, 10 times the amount of all of them because they're supporting each other. They're not competing for the ground space like, a bunch of carrots mashed together. You've had the experience, if you're a gardener and grown carrots, of pulling them out and all your carrots are like mashed together and pushing each other around and so forth. Just think how much bigger they could get if you had a carrot here and then a tomato here, and the carrot is filling this deep underground layer and the tomato is filling this upper above ground layer. There's the possibilities of how much you can grow expands exponentially, and you begin to have what looks like a forest but is a garden. Now, I've also mentioned that these tend to be perennial focused systems, perennial plants and so forth. And many people will say, well, if you can only grow perennials, there aren't a lot of foods possible. There's so few to choose from, because that takes out the option of tomatoes and bell peppers and all these things that we love to grow. There's just not that many perennial foods to eat. And I say that is simply a matter of not understanding what makes a perennial and what is a perennial. Okay, let me give you a few examples of perennial foods that you've probably heard of. And I can assure you there are thousands that you haven't heard of. Because every day, as a horticulturalist, I am discovering new foods all the time, things that I've never considered. But these are just some that you've almost certainly heard of. Okay? You've got tree fruit, such as apples, pears, peaches, apricots, nectarines, plums, and cherries. In tree nuts, you've got walnut, chestnut, almond, hazel, hickory, and pecan. In berries, you've got raspberry, blackberry, strawberry, blueberry, mulberry, grape, gooseberry, and currants. Now, some of you are going to say, grapes aren't berries. Well, you could respond with the horticultural response, well, which ones are true berries? You know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about little things you pop in your mouth because they're sweet and taste good, okay? Of leafy greens, you've got perennial kale, French sorrel, watercress, amaranth, perennial broccoli, horseradish, linden tree, believe it or not, linden trees, which they're one of those trees that everybody has in front of their church building. You can eat the leaves like lettuce, and I recommend it. Anyway, continuing. Arugula, and many species of reseeding lettuces and mustards. And I'll pause for a moment on that to say that perennial systems do not require that the plant be a perennial species. It simply implies that the plant comes back on its own. And if you've got certain kinds of mustards, certain kinds of lettuces, you let them grow and you let them go to seed. You let them do that bolting thing that everybody says, don't let them bolt. Okay, let them do that. They can become, many of them, they can become perennial systems. And they will grow their annuals every year, a few here and a few there, between all the other wonderful, lush perennial foods that you're growing, okay? Among the grains, we've got perennial rye, perennial buckwheat, perennial wheat, perennial rice. Now, those last two are new and untested in many areas, but they're worth looking into, right? Of the herbs, you've got fennel, thyme, dill, mint, and mint includes every kind of mint, such as peppermint, chocolate mint, spearmint, and so on. There's tons of them, apple mint, whatever. Also, lemon balm, Greek oregano, garlic, chives, walking onion, sage, Roman chamomile, marjoram, reseeding parsley, winter savory, anise, which is where licorice candy originally comes from, bay laurel, which is bay leaves for spaghetti and so forth, chicory, and ginger. And then among other types, you've got rhubarb, asparagus, artichoke, multiplying leeks, sea beet, and sea celery. Now, this is just a list of the ones that most of you have probably heard of, most of these, or eaten them at some point. If you were to grow all of that, it would be difficult to justify throwing out all of them in order to grow your row of tomatoes. And I'm not suggesting by any of this that you can't grow tomatoes. You absolutely can, and you should, if that's what you want to grow. But you can grow it among these things. You have some annual seeds that you're putting out every year because those are the ones that you really, really want, and they are growing amidst the things that come back every year and feed you year after year after year with very little to no effort. And there are thousands of others, okay? There are thousands of plants that once you try them, you'll be like, whoa, I never even heard of this, and it's delicious. And it's incredibly healthy for you, nutritious. But I hope this list gives you a bit of an idea of what kind of plants you might consider putting in your forest garden. And the more you learn about ecology, climate, weather, botany, food, nutrition, and medicine, the more equipped you'll be to create and expand your forest garden system. In this class, we're going to talk about enough of the basics to give you a good head start. And I recommend, after this class is finished, to continue to go on and study these subjects in depth. What I'm going to be giving you is not only the basics to get you creating your own forest garden, to teach you what you need to know to be able to create one, but also give you words and terms that you can further research by Google searches, by YouTube videos, by taking further classes, so that you'll know what to study in order to directly affect your forest garden and make it all the better, make it really a powerful system. And by following the principles that we're going to talk about to reclaim your soil and get it into a natural state that is going to feed itself through your plants and through the elements in your system. And as we talk about what kinds of plants are going to work for your climate, for your zone, for your weather patterns, for the angle of your yard in relation to the sun or to mountains and so forth. We're going to talk about all of that in order to be able to give you the best system that you can possibly have in the area where you live, exactly in the spot where you're at. And the fun thing about this is, even if there's climate limitations and maybe cold, you have a really cold climate or something, you can create little pockets of microclimates where it's a little bit warmer, where there's a little bit less weather problems and so forth. And we're going to talk about all of that in this class. Now, I've given you an overview, a broad view of it. Please do not be intimidated by all that we've said. We're going to take this a bite at a time. We're going to do this in small increments so that you can get started right away. That's one of the reasons that I started this class this early in the year. For many of you in climates like mine, it's still a month or two before we can start putting seeds in the ground. But it's not too early to start other things. And let me say this also. In the process of building your forest garden, this is not something that is a springtime project. This is something that you can be working on year-round. I usually am ready to start for the spring, getting ready for spring, right about the time my plants in the fall are finished harvesting. Once I've pulled them off the trees or whatever, now it's time to start getting ready for springtime the next year. Not because I'm going to be messing with the plants that are already down, but because I'm going to take the patches that I have not yet developed and start developing them, which, by means of mulching and composting and gathering of materials, leaves that have dropped off of trees, and so forth. It's a year-round opportunity, but don't let that scare you to think that it's way too much work, because like we said before, it's a little bit of work up front, and it'll take a couple of years to kind of get a system working for you, and then your work will go down, and your work will go down until it gets to the point where there's really not any work involved. You may have to turn on a sprinkler in the hottest month twice or something. These systems are incredibly dynamic at taking care of themselves. But you got to know the principles. And that's the focus of the Wild Tater podcast. You'll notice we talk a lot about individual plants because they are the actual building blocks. They are the Legos that are making the building. But in the discussion of those plants, we'll be discussing so much of what is required to turn a garden into a forest. And we are seeking to make a food forest that can support us for years, decades, maybe even generations to come. So if you're ready to start trying to create your own food forest using these forest gardening principles that we've been talking about, then keep coming back, because the Wild Tater podcast is here to help you through it. Thank you so much for listening.